Dominic Caruso had ordered the deaths of 3 men before breakfast on a Tuesday. But tonight, he sat in a cracked vinyl booth at Riverside Diner on King Street West, wearing a flannel shirt from Value Village, waiting for another woman who'd eventually leave. Date number 9. 9 blind dates in 7 months. 9 women hand-selected by his cousin Rosa, who meant well and understood nothing. 9 women who'd arrived to meet Danny C. A quiet guy, maybe mid-level construction. He drove a used Civic. Nothing remarkable about him except the jawline. 9 women who'd suddenly recalled a prior commitment the moment they registered the off-brand watch, the thrift store flannel, and a phone with an actual crack running across the screen. The door opened. A woman in a camel wool coat stepped in from the November cold, her eyes sweeping the diner once, twice, landing on him. Her smile held for exactly 3 seconds. Then she clocked the flannel, the cheap watch, and the empty table with its 2 laminated menus and a sugar dispenser that had seen better decades. The smile didn't disappear. It just stopped meaning anything. She sat. Her name was Christine. "Danny? That's me." She checked her phone, pressed her lips together in a shape that wasn't quite a smile. "I actually just got a message. Work thing, it's insane, I'm so sorry. Rain check?" She was already reaching for her coat. Dominic said nothing. He didn't watch her leave, and he just looked at the coffee going cold in front of him and thought, 9. A hand appeared at the edge of his vision. His cup was lifted, refilled, set back down, all in one unhurried motion. No fanfare, no apology on Christine's behalf, no performance of sympathy, just coffee, hot, immediate. "You want pie while you wait?" said a voice above him. "Or are we past the optimism stage?" He looked up. Maya, name tag. Natural curly hair pinned up loosely, a few coils escaping at the temples. Dark, steady eyes that looked at him the way very few people ever had, directly, without agenda, without calculation. Like he was simply a man in a booth who might want pie. She was already turning back toward the counter, and Dominic Caruso, who had not been caught off guard in 11 years, found himself saying, "Yeah, pie." That was the night everything changed. But to understand why a man like Dominic was sitting in a diner on King Street West, wearing Value Village flannel and a broken Casio, to understand what 9 failed dates and 2 years of careful loneliness had built inside him, you had to start earlier. You had to start in Hamilton. Maya Okafor had a system. Between 10 p.m. and close, when the dinner rush thinned to insomniacs and overnight workers and the occasional man sitting alone in booth 9, she studied. Nursing textbooks cracked open across the back booth. Pharmacology, pathophysiology, clinical assessment. Coffee at her elbow, highlighter in her teeth, one ear always tuned to the door. She'd learned to read a room the way she read a patient chart. Quickly. What's presenting? What's being hidden? What the numbers aren't saying. It was a skill she'd had long before nursing school. Growing up in Scarborough, eldest of 3, you learned to read rooms or you didn't survive them. Then her father had left when she was 11, not dramatically, not with a scene. He'd just gradually become someone who visited less and less until the visit stopped entirely and nobody said his name much anymore. Her mother Adays had filled the space he left the way strong women do, by working harder, sleeping less, and never once letting Maya see her cry. Not until the cancer diagnosis 3 years ago, when crying became, briefly, the only reasonable response. Adays was in remission now. "I define okay," Maya had told the man in booth 9, and she'd meant it. Her mother was alive and medication managed and still working part-time at the dry cleaners on Lawrence, which she absolutely should not have been doing on those feet. The bills from the treatment were still arriving. They would be arriving for a long time. Then there was Marcus. 17. Brilliant, angrier than he had any right to be, and also, Maya understood, that even when it exhausted her, angrier than he had every right not to be. He'd inherited their father's absence and their mother's stubbornness in equal and combustible measure. He was the smartest person in any room he walked into, and lately he'd been walking into the wrong rooms. She'd seen the signs for months, new friends she didn't recognize, hours she couldn't account for. The careful way he answered her questions, not evasive, just edited, like he was managing her. And she'd tried everything she could think of, which lately felt like not very much. She uncapped the highlighter, stared at the page without reading it. Table 7 needs a refill, and also I think he's writing a novel. Diane materialized beside her, coffee pot in hand, nodding toward the front of the diner. Diane was 53, had worked Riverside for 19 years, and had developed strong opinions about all of their regulars. She expressed these opinions constantly and without invitation. Me and Booth 9, Diane added with a different kind of nod, is back. Maya didn't look up. I know. Third time this week. No date this time. I know. He's cute, though. Maya turned a page. He's sad. Diane was quiet for a moment. Then, same thing sometimes. She refilled table 7 and moved on. Maya waited until 1:15 a.m., after the last customer had gone and the chairs were up and Diane was counting the till. And before she did what she sometimes did at the end of a long shift, she took a fresh order slip and she drew. She drew people, never buildings, never streetscapes, never the romantic fog of the city outside the window, just faces. The retired postal worker from Kingston who sat at the counter every Tuesday and always ordered the same thing and always tipped exactly 15%. She'd drawn the particular sadness around his eyes that appeared whenever someone spoke to him in passing and he realized they weren't going to stay. The overnight security guard with the broken knuckle he'd never had properly set. The insomniac professor with the wedding ring he kept turning. She drew what people were carrying. Tonight she drew the man from booth 9. She didn't draw the flannel, didn't draw the cheap watch or the cracked phone. Those were costume, and she'd known they were costume since the second night, the way you know a thing without being able to say exactly why. She drew the jaw, the particular set of it, controlled tension, the kind that came not from anger, but from long practice at not showing anger. She drew the eyes, or the way they tracked the room without appearing to. She drew the exhaustion underneath the stillness. A man who'd been responsible for something enormous for a very long time and had never once put it down. She sat with the drawing for a moment. Then she folded it and slid it into her apron pocket. She didn't know why she kept it. She told herself it was just a sketch. She was, in this one specific matter, not as observant as she thought. He stopped scheduling dates, and he told Rosa he needed a break, that the app wasn't working, that he was busy, all of which was partially true, and none of which was the real reason. The real reason arrived at Riverside Diner every night around 10 p.m., ordered coffee, and sat in booth 9 until Maya had a free moment. He always had a reason, technically. Laptop, paperwork, the general performance of a man with somewhere to be who'd simply stopped in. But the laptop rarely opened and the paperwork stayed in the car. And after the third week, Dominic stopped pretending, even to himself, that this was anything other than what it was. Before the diner, there was always something. A call he took outside, pacing the sidewalk in the November cold, his breath visible, his voice dropping through 3 languages in the span of 4 minutes, English to Italian to a clipped functional French for the man in Montreal who responded better to it. And the men inside the diner never knew what they were registering when he walked back in, just that something in the room recalibrated slightly. Shoulders straightened, eyes flicked away. It was the particular deference that certain kinds of authority produce in people who can't name what they're sensing. Then he reached booth 9 and became Danny again. Flannel, coffee, bad pie. The first night back, no date, no pretense, Maya raised an eyebrow and said nothing. Set down coffee. Moved on. When she passed again, she slid a small plate in front of him without being asked. "Butter tart," she said. "Mr. Petrov makes them himself. I'm legally obligated to recommend them." He ate it, set down his fork. "That's the best thing I've eaten in a month." Maya looked at him with something close to pity. "That's sad. The butter tart is mediocre." "Night 3, he asked where she was from. She told him Scarborough, East End, Lawrence, and Markham. "I'm the kind of neighborhood that built people whether they wanted to be built or not." He said Hamilton. She glanced at his hands, resting flat on the table, looked back up. "Dock worker, Dad?" He blinked. "How did you—" "Your hands," she said simply. "You didn't grow up soft." He was quiet for a moment. Something shifted behind his eyes. Not quite surprise. More like the careful recalibration of a man realizing the room he's in is different from the one he thought he'd entered. No, he said finally. "I didn't." Night 6, she told him about her mother. Not all of it. Just the shape of it. The diagnosis, the treatment, the particular exhaustion of being the person everyone else leaned on while you quietly absorbed the weight of possibly losing the only parent who'd stayed. She said it in the same level tone she used for everything, which somehow made it worse. Dominic went very still. When he didn't say "I'm sorry," or "that must have been so hard," or any of the other phrases people deployed in these moments like small, inadequate bandages, he just asked, "Is she okay now?" Maya looked at him. "Define okay." A pause, long enough to be honest. "Yeah," she said. "She's okay." He nodded once, like that was the only answer that mattered, and then he drank his coffee and let the silence sit without filling it, which was, Maya would think later, and one of the more decent things a person had done in a while. Night 9, she showed him the drawing. He stared at it for a long time without speaking. "That's not what I look like," he said finally. "It's exactly what you look like." He didn't argue. He folded it with the kind of care people reserved for things they didn't want to admit mattered, and slid it into his jacket pocket. He didn't open the laptop on the drive home. Back at the Bay Street penthouse, and he pinned the sketch to the wall beside the window overlooking the lake. Stood there for a moment in the dark, city lights smearing across the water below. Then he picked up his phone and dialed. "I need a quiet background check," he said when his security lead picked up. "Her name is Maya Okafor." The report arrived at 6:47 a.m. Dominic read it at the kitchen island in the Bay Street penthouse, still in yesterday's shirt, coffee untouched beside him. Maya Adaeze Okafor, 26. Ryerson University, Bachelor of Science in Nursing 3rd year. Current GPA 3.8. Employment, Riverside Diner, King Street West, evenings. Scarborough Community Walk-in Clinic, weekends. Outstanding student debt, $34,200. Residence, rent-controlled apartment, Scarborough, shared with mother and one minor sibling. No criminal record, no known associations, no financial irregularities of any kind. At the bottom, and his security lead had written a single word the way he always did when a subject came back completely clear. Clean. Dominic sat with that word longer than he expected. He thought about what his own file would say. The legitimate businesses stacked up front like a wall. 3 construction firms, a property holding company, a logistics operation that moved real cargo alongside less documented freight. And behind that wall, if you knew where to look, everything else. Say a decade of decisions that had made him untouchable and kept him awake at 4 a.m. in a penthouse where every surface was expensive and nothing felt like his. Clean. He closed the folder. That afternoon he drove to Mississauga. The warehouse was climate-controlled, which was either a comfort or an irony depending on your philosophical disposition. 3 men from a Montreal syndicate sat across a table that had cost $14,000. Dominic had bought it specifically for rooms like this, because a table like that told people something before anyone spoke. He sat at its head in a suit that cost more than a semester of Maya's tuition and discussed the redistribution of port access across 2 provinces with the same tone most men used to discuss quarterly projections. One of the Montreal men had a daughter. Dominic knew this because he knew everything about everyone he sat across from. The daughter was 9. She had a name. She went to school somewhere in the plateau and had no idea that her father spent Tuesday afternoons in warehouses in Mississauga negotiating the movement of things that destroyed other people's families. Neither did most of the people those decisions affected. That was, Dominic understood, the entire architecture of it. The distance between cause and consequence, maintained deliberately and at great expense. He drove back to Toronto and went to the diner. It was a Tuesday night rush. The booths full, Diane moving fast, Maya moving faster. She brought his coffee without stopping, just a brief glance of recognition as she passed, warm and unhurried even in the middle of chaos. No performance in it. She looked at him the same way she looked at the postal worker at the counter, the exhausted resident from the hospital 2 blocks over, the elderly woman who always ordered tea and sat for 2 hours. She treats everyone exactly like this, he realized. And there was no angle, no calibration based on what a person might be worth. She was simply entirely present. And it was so uncommon that it took him a moment to identify what he was actually looking at. He was still working this out when he overheard her at the counter with old Mr. Beaumont, 71, who came in every Tuesday and whose heat, it emerged, had been cut off 3 days ago by a landlord who was within his technical rights and entirely without conscience. Maya listened. They asked 2 clarifying questions, then took her break 10 minutes early, stepped outside, and made a series of phone calls that he could partially hear through the window, her voice precise, firm, escalating efficiently through whoever picked up until she reached whoever mattered. By the time she came back in, her cheeks flushed from the cold, Mr. Beaumont's heat was back on. She didn't mention it to anyone. Dominic left $200 under his coffee cup and was out the door before she turned around. He didn't need to watch her find it. He already knew the sequence, the pause, the calculation, the quick scan of the diner for him. Gone again. She deserves to know who he is. The thought arrived on the drive home, quiet and uninvited, the way the most inconvenient truths always did. He pressed it down. He'd been here before, that particular threshold where honesty felt briefly possible, into where the distance between what he was and what someone deserved to know seemed momentarily crossable. He knew what happened next. He'd watched it happen. The moment the real information entered, everything changed shape. People became careful, grateful in the wrong way, or frightened in the wrong way, or, worst of all, suddenly, strategically interested in ways they hadn't been before. He'd paid for honesty before, but it was never him who paid the most. It was always the person who'd had the misfortune of meaning something to him first. Don't, he told himself. And underneath that, quieter and more dangerous, the thought he couldn't quite push all the way down. But what if this time is different? He stared at the highway and said nothing and drove, and the city came up around him glittering and indifferent. And somewhere in Scarborough, Maya Okafor was finishing her shift and studying pharmacology in a back booth, and had absolutely no idea that the most dangerous man in Toronto was thinking about her on the QEW at 11:45 p.m., and losing, for the first time in a long time, the argument with himself. Subscribe now so you don't miss the moment everything changes, because in this story, it changes fast, and it changes everything. She didn't come in Wednesday. She didn't come in Thursday either. Dominic sat in booth 9 both nights anyway, which told him something about himself he didn't particularly want to examine. Diane refilled his coffee without comment, which told him she'd noticed more than she let on. Friday night, the door opened at 9:52 p.m. and Maya walked in. He knew immediately. It wasn't the uniform or the pinned hair or anything visible. It was the way she moved, that efficient forward momentum that was as much a part of her as her name, and how it was gone. Or she crossed the diner like someone navigating by memory rather than intention. Present in body. Somewhere else entirely, in every way that mattered. She almost passed his booth without stopping. Maya. Just her name. Quietly. She stopped, stood with her back to him for a moment. Then she turned around and sat down across from him, and the words came out in pieces, the way things do when they've been held too tightly for too long. Marcus. And picked up 4 nights ago in a sweep near Raven Street. Possession with intent. The kind of charge that sounded administrative until you understood what it actually meant for a 17-year-old with no record and a public defender carrying 40 other cases. 6 weeks to the hearing. 3 legal aid offices, all of them sympathetic, none of them able to move fast enough or with enough weight. Her private lawyers were quoting numbers that Maya had written down and then folded up and put away because looking at them too long made it hard to breathe. "He's smart, Danny," she said. Her voice was level. Her hands were not. "He made bad choices, but he's not. He's not what they'll make him into if this goes wrong." Dominic's jaw had tightened approximately 30 seconds into the telling and had not loosened since. The Raven Street boys. He knew exactly who they were. And a sub-franchise on his Eastern network, licensed 3 years ago to a mid-level operator named Garrett, who'd come recommended and run clean for 2 years and apparently stopped running clean sometime in the last 8 months without anyone in Dominic's organization flagging it. Because nobody had been watching closely enough. Because Dominic had built an empire large enough that certain corners of it operated without his daily attention. And this was what happened in those corners. She and a 17-year-old kid with a 3.4 GPA and a bad crew and a sister who worked double shifts to keep the lights on, was currently sitting in a system that would not be gentle with him because of it. One call. The thought was immediate and automatic. Tonight. Marcus's file reorganized, charges quietly downgraded, the right lawyer materializing from the right nonprofit with the right connections. Done before midnight. He'd done it before. Cleaner than this. For less reason. But he'd also watched what happened after. The shift in how people looked at him once they understood what he could move. Gratitude curdling into something more complicated. Obligation, unease, the dawning awareness of what it meant to owe a man like him. He would not do that to her. He would not become, in her eyes, a debt with a face. "Tell me everything about the public defender situation," he said instead. "The exact office, the case number if you have it. Let me think." She looked at him. You're a photographer, Danny." "I know people," he said simply. "Let me think." That night, alone in the penthouse, he made 3 calls through 2 proxies he'd never used for anything personal before. A Toronto criminal defense nonprofit, flagged for a priority youth intake. The Ontario Justice Diversion Program administrator, contacted through a shell account. Marcus Okafor's name attached to a detailed eligibility summary that Dominic wrote himself. And a separate, their quieter call about Garrett and the Raven Street operation. Licensing pulled, crew scattered, the whole structure dissolved with the kind of efficiency that left no public trace. He did not tell Maya any of it. 3 days later, she came in with light back in her eyes. She found him in booth 9 and grabbed his hand across the table without thinking. Warm, immediate, the spontaneous relief of someone who'd been braced for the worst and felt it lift. The legal aid office called, and they found someone. A real lawyer, Danny, like an actual... She has a record on youth diversion cases. She called Marcus herself. She stopped, pressed her lips together. "I don't know how. Things just started moving." Dominic looked at their hands. "Things move sometimes," he said carefully. "People get lucky." Maya studied him for a moment, those steady dark eyes doing what they always did. Reading the thing underneath the thing. Then she squeezed his hand once and stood up to start her shift. And Dominic picked up his coffee cup and said nothing, And outside, the snow had started again, quiet and indifferent, covering everything. 3 weeks after Marcus's hearing date was quietly rescheduled, and the right lawyer filed the right paperwork and the charge environment around a 17-year-old in Scarborough shifted in ways nobody could fully explain, Maya arrived at booth 9 carrying 2 coffees. She set one in front of Dominic, sat down across from him. He raised an eyebrow. Meant she reached into her apron pocket and placed her phone on the table between them, screen up, and slid it toward him the way you slide something toward a person when you've been deciding whether to do it for a long time and have finally decided. A Globe and Mail article, 2019. The photo was grainy, taken from distance, slightly blurred, the kind of image that suggested the photographer had been trying not to be noticed. A man in a dark coat leaving a Yorkville restaurant. On the caption beneath it read, "Dominic Caruso, alleged organized crime figure, photographed leaving a Yorkville restaurant following a federal investigation into..." The screen timed out. The diner was quiet around them. Tuesday night, late, just the hiss of the coffee machine, and Diane running a cloth along the far counter with the focused disinterest of someone who had made a deliberate choice not to look in this direction. "How long?" His voice was very even. And it was the voice he used in warehouses in Mississauga, the one that gave nothing away while everything was being calculated behind it. 3 weeks in, Maya said. She folded both hands around her coffee cup. "You left a paper receipt on the table once. The name on the credit card wasn't Danny." A pause. "I Googled the name." The snow outside the window came down in the particular slow way it did on windless Toronto nights. Unhurried, like it had nowhere specific to be. "And you said nothing." Not a question. He already knew the answer. He was working out what the answer meant. "I wanted to see what you'd do," Maya said. Her voice was steady. This was not a confrontation. He understood that now. She wasn't angry. She'd made a decision weeks ago, and she'd been patient with it in the way she was patient with everything, completely, without visible effort. "When I told you about Marcus, when you were sitting right there, and you could have used that. I used knowing who you were, and what you could move to step in and fix it, and let me know you'd fixed it. I wanted to see what you'd choose." "What did I choose?" She met his eyes directly. "You let me struggle for 2 days. Then things quietly got better in ways that had your fingerprints all over them, even though I couldn't prove it." She didn't look away. "You helped him without owning the help. You made it so I'd never owe you for it." A beat. "That's not manipulation, Dominic. And that's something else entirely." The silence that followed was long and full, the kind that had weight and texture, that meant something different from the absence of speech. He looked at the phone, the timed-out screen, his own face behind a grainy lens in 2019, caught leaving a restaurant, reduced to a caption in a story that told the truth about him and nothing about him simultaneously. "You should be afraid of me." He said it quietly, not as a threat. He needed her to understand that. Oh, as a fact, a debt he owed her, delivered plainly. This is what is true, and you should factor it accordingly. Maya looked at him for a long moment. "I know what you are," she said. "I'm asking who you want to be." Nobody had ever asked him that. In 41 years, not once, in those exact words, with that exact steadiness, not hoping for a particular answer, not afraid of the real one, just asking, making space for whatever came back. He reached across the table. She didn't pull back. Outside, the snow kept falling past the neon sign, slow and wordless. Diane found something to organize near the kitchen. The diner held its quiet, and Dominic Caruso, for the first time in longer than he could accurately measure, had nothing to hide behind, no flannel, no alias, no careful distance, and felt, against all prior evidence, no desire to run. He told her 4 days later, not because he had to, The books were already clean, the associate reassigned, and the foundation grant anonymously processed and on its way to Mr. Petrov's account under a legitimate Ontario small business development heading that would require no explanation and raise no flags. Nobody would ever know. He could have said nothing, and it would have stayed that way indefinitely. He told her because she'd asked who he wanted to be, and this was part of the answer. He waited until a slow Sunday morning, her last table cleared, Diane gone home. Maya sat across from him, and he told her plainly. Riverside Diner had been used as a minor cash flow laundering point by an associate of his for approximately 14 months, without the owner's knowledge, without anyone in this building ever knowing what was moving quietly through the numbers behind them. "Mr. Petrov," she said. Not a question, just the name, Landing. He had no idea. His family has no idea. Well, it was clean in the way those things are kept clean, invisible to everyone except the people running it. Maya was silent. Outside, a streetcar ground past on King. She looked at the counter, at the coffee machine, at the sugar dispensers that had seen better decades, the place she'd worked for 11 months, the place she'd studied in at 1 a.m. and drawn portraits in and watched regulars grow old in. "Did you know," she said carefully, "when you first came here?" "No." "When did you find out?" 6 weeks in." She looked at him then. "And you kept coming?" "Yes." "Why?" He didn't answer immediately. She waited. She was good at waiting, he'd learned, in the way people were good at things they'd been practicing their whole lives without calling it practice. Because by then, he said, it wasn't about the diner. She absorbed this, turned it over the way she turned everything over, methodically, without rushing to a verdict. Yet he'd watched her do this in other contexts, the nurse's habit of triaging before treating. What's the damage? What's been addressed? What's the risk going forward? "It's clean now?" she asked, finally. "Completely. Books reorganized. Associate removed. There's a small business foundation grant coming to Petrov next month. Legitimate, untraceable to me, no strings." 31 years he's run this place, Maya said quietly. "I know." She nodded once, and then she stood up, got her coat, and said, "Walk with me." They walked the lake path for an hour in the Ontario cold, breath visible, the water flat and dark beside them. She asked questions, and he answered them. Honestly, completely, without the careful editing he'd practiced for a decade. It was deeply uncomfortable, and neither of them stopped. How it started. Hamilton, his father's debts, the particular sequence of decisions that each seemed reasonable in isolation and catastrophic in accumulation. What he controlled now. What it cost. Whether he'd ever tried to leave and what had happened when he did. He answered everything. His voice stayed even. Hers did too. They were not holding hands. They were walking close enough that their arms occasionally touched, and neither of them moved away. The following Thursday, she took him to her mother's apartment in Scarborough without warning, which was either an act of profound trust or mild cruelty, and possibly both. And Adaize Okafor fed them jollof rice and studied Dominic across the table with the focused attention of a woman who had survived enough to know exactly what she was looking at. He sat straight, ate everything on his plate, and answered her questions directly. After a long silence, Adaize said something in Igbo. Maya's mouth curved slightly. "She says you have a guilty face but honest eyes." A pause. "She says that's actually the better combination." Dominic looked at Adaize. "Well, what's the worst combination?" Maya translated the response. Adaize's expression didn't change. "Innocent face," Maya said. "Dishonest eyes. She's seen more of those." He walked her home at midnight. They stood outside her building on a street that smelled like winter and exhaust and someone's cooking from a window above. He didn't ask to come up. She didn't suggest it. "Same time Tuesday?" she said. "Yeah," he said. She went inside. The door closed. And Maya Okafor leaned against it in the dark hallway and smiled, fully, without calculation, without armor, without the careful steadiness she carried everywhere like a second uniform. Just smiled, like something had been decided. 6 months later, Dominic Caruso walked into Riverside Diner looking exactly like what he was. Dark wool coat, good boots, and the Patek Philippe on his wrist catching the light as he pushed open the door, the one that had spent months locked in a glove compartment 2 blocks away, while he performed ordinariness in Value Village flannel. He wore it easily now, not as a display, just as a fact. The regulars glanced up the way they always did when the door opened. Something in the room shifted almost imperceptibly. That animal register people had around certain kinds of authority. It felt before it was understood, and then settled. Mr. Petrov looked up from behind the counter, nodded once with the particular warmth he'd developed for Dominic over recent months, without knowing precisely why, and went back to the till. Diane watched him cross the floor with an expression that said she had formed strong opinions about this development and was, for once, keeping them to herself. He sat in the corner booth, their booth, on the one with the crack in the vinyl that nobody had gotten around to fixing in what appeared to be several administrations. He waited. Maya finished her shift at 10. She came out of the kitchen with her apron still on, name tag still reading Maya, curly hair still pinned up with a few coils loose at the temples exactly the way they'd been the first night he'd looked up from a cold cup of coffee and said, "Yeah, pie." She slid into the seat across from him without ceremony, the way she always did, and looked at him with those same steady dark eyes that had been reading him accurately since approximately the 3rd week. "You're wearing the watch," she said. "I'm wearing the watch." She accepted this with a small nod. Then she noticed the objects on the table between them, a key, unremarkable, silver, on a plain ring, and beside it, a single folded document. She looked at him. He said nothing. She picked up the document and opened it. It took her a moment to understand what she was reading. A lease agreement. A Scarborough address. She knew it. Recognized it the way you recognized a street you'd walked 100 times. She'd pointed at that building once, months ago, on one of their lake walks, its windows dark and its facade tired and its potential obvious to anyone paying attention. "That building's been empty for 2 years, she'd said. "Someone could do something real with that." He'd said nothing at the time. She'd assumed he hadn't heard her. She read further. The foundation documentation. The funding structure, legitimate, audited, clean in every sense of the word, the kind of clean that didn't require his particular skill set to maintain. And at the top of the operational heading, in plain type, Adaeze Okafor Community Health Center. Maya stared at the document for a long time. The diner held its quiet around them. Outside, the first snow of another Toronto November moved past the neon sign in slow, unhurried curtains. When she looked up, her eyes were bright, and her voice was even, and both of these things were true simultaneously, which was, Dominic had learned, exactly how Maya Okafor was built. "This doesn't fix what you are," she said. "No," he said. "But it's what I want to build. With you, if you'll let me." A pause. One real thing at a time. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached across the table and picked up the key. They walked out together. The door swung shut behind them, and the bell above it marking their exit the same way it had marked date 9, and every night since, and all the ordinary consequential evenings in between. At the curb, the black Escalade idled. His driver, who had spent 7 months finding creative parking solutions within a 2-block radius of this diner, stood beside it with the practiced neutrality of a man who had seen everything and would be taking it to his grave. Maya stopped, looked at the car, looked at Dominic. "How long?" "Since night 1. She laughed, full and unguarded, the laugh he'd been collecting like evidence since the first time he'd heard it. You really committed to the broke flannel bit. Can you blame me? She considered this for exactly 1 second. Then she took his hand, and they got in, and the door closed, and Toronto moved past the windows in its glittering, indifferent way. And behind them, Riverside Diner glowed neon into the falling snow like it had for 31 years and intended to continue indefinitely. Money hadn't brought them together. His world had almost kept them apart. But truth, the terrifying, inconvenient, costly kind, had made all the difference. Maya Okafor had looked at the most dangerous man in Toronto and seen, underneath all of it, someone who wanted to be worth seeing. And Dominic Caruso had sat in a diner for months, eating mediocre butter tarts, leaving enormous tips, and waiting, without knowing he was waiting, for someone who would look at him exactly like that. Some things, even in the darkest worlds, are still worth beginning. If this story found you at a moment when you'd stopped believing that the person underneath the performance was worth finding, yours or someone else's, consider this. The most important thing Maya did wasn't forgive Dominic. Now it was refuse to let him hide. The most important thing Dominic did wasn't build the clinic. It was to choose honesty when concealment was still completely available to him. You already know which people in your life see through the flannel to the jaw. The controlled exhaustion, the thing you're carrying that you haven't put down. The question the story is really asking, the one it's been asking since Booth 9 on a cold November night, is simply this. Are you going to let them? Subscribe. Stay. There are more stories like this one waiting for you.